Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening for those of our friends in Europe who are joining us today. I'm Dick Morningstar. I'm the founding chairman of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and among other things, a former U.S. ambassador to the European Union. And it's my honor to lead this discussion today on the United Kingdom's energy priorities with Secretary and Member of Parliament Grant Shapps, who is the Secretary of State for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. And I guess to state the obvious, with Russia's war in Ukraine and the ensuing energy crisis, that's highlighted the risks of energy underinvestment and dependence on malign actors, and has demonstrated the need for a cohesive and a strategic approach to energy security and decarbonization. And I want to emphasize that the green transition and decarbonization relates directly to energy security because, among other things, it will reduce dependence on single actors like Russia. And as part of the response to these challenges, the UK government has recently launched its Powering Up Britain plan, which outlines how the government will enhance energy security and deliver on its net zero commitments. And it's fascinating that the Secretary's title is Secretary for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, which tells you how important Britain sees the net zero commitments. But this comprehensive strategy aims to advance energy independence and economic security through a series of multi-pound investments to expand clean energy and to take critical steps to achieve the UK's goal of zero emissions by 2050. Today, we're lucky to have Secretary Shapps with us, who will speak on the priorities for implementing this initiative and the department's plans, and we'll get into a whole bunch of related issues. Let me remind you, we have both an in-person audience and a virtual audience. This is a public session and it's on the record, and that unfortunately we can only handle questions from the in-person audience. And so if you have questions, there's a microphone over to the right where you'll be able to line up or get up and ask the question. So let's start. So with that, maybe first, Mr. Secretary, you could tell us about your trip. I realize you had an unfortunate delay at Heathrow Airport, which lasted overnight. But you're in great shape for the session, this afternoon. But what are you going to be doing here in Washington, and how important do you think the U.S.-British relationship is, U.S.-UK relationship with respect to the topics we were talking about, energy security, the green transition? How can we all work together on this?
Yeah. Well, Ambassador, first of all, it's great to be here. It's fantastic to be at Atlantic Council, and brilliant to be discussing this issue, which is so high up both of our population's agendas, and in fact, many people throughout the world, obviously as a consequence of what happened in Ukraine. But actually, on the way here, we passed the old post office pavilion, and that fantastic statue of Benjamin Franklin's just out to the front and to the right of it. And I was reminded that he was, of course, American-British. He had an American mother and a British father.
And lived in Paris.
Lived in Paris, yes, amongst other places.
Right.
Yeah. And obviously was absolutely critical to one of the founding figures, central founding figures of the United States. But it did remind me of, that sort of very, very close relationship. And everyone will, at least in somewhere in their minds, remember that he had that famous experiment. He was an energy pioneer because he put a kite up in 1752 and demonstrated lightning was electricity, which was news to many because it was unproven at the time. But in 1757, he moved to the UK. He moved to London. I don't know where Paris was in all of that, but at some point he lived in London. And the bit of this that struck me, he lived in a street called Craven Street, And Craven Street is right by where this new department for energy security and net zero has its new home. We're about to move in there in the old War Office, right on Whitehall there. So, I mean, you just kind of, perhaps by a quirk of nature, get the sense of, our obvious history stretching back, but on the energy side of things throughout history, pioneering so many of the big energy breakthroughs, including nuclear power on the defense side, obviously the Manhattan Project. On the civil side, the UK created the world's first nuclear civil power station at Calder Hall in Cumbria. It was producing a massive 40 megawatts, actually on the side, because what it was really doing was producing plutonium at the time for our military nuclear program. But our histories are tied, and our approaches to what's happened with Putin, what's happened in Ukraine are closely tied together as well. And if you look at, by a long stretch, the United States has put the resource into, helping to fight Putin's evil war. But the number 2 country is the UK. And again, we just share that natural instinct to always be the countries to be in defense of those freedoms and liberties. But energy has become a sort of blackmail. Putin has used energy as a weapon of war to blackmail the West in the hope that we would all crumble. We haven't. We have managed to see our way through the first very difficult winter in our various different ways. I mean, Germany had a pipeline and a second one on its way. They had 47% of their gas was from Putin. The UK was much more fortunate. We didn't have a gas pipeline. We only bought 4% of our gas. So it wasn't such a big wrench, but nonetheless, we still suffered in our energy prices. And so we know that our response for this year and going forward has to be the thing that you just mentioned, which is we can have renewable energy which splits us off from the gas reliance, from the hydrocarbons, and nuclear in a renaissance that is going to make us energy independent. It's popular at home. I know it's popular here. It deals with a big concern, which is the cost of living for our citizens in both countries. And once again, I mean, just sort of back to the start with Benjamin Franklin, the 2 countries working closely together. I've come here directly from a meeting with your Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, discussing precisely these issues and how we can work in much closer cooperation. And that's our 3rd meeting in 3 months to move this agenda forward. So there's a lot of serious work going on. But I think that's the challenge that lays ahead of us. Cheap, reliable energy that no despotic leader can prevent us from accessing in the future.
So, energy certainly is and should be part of the special relationship between the UK and the US. What are where can that cooperation take place? How can 1 and 1 make 3?
So I would say, first of all, the UK has had in the last 10, 15 years a big move into renewables. So if you take offshore wind, for example, in the North Sea, we have the world's biggest wind farm. But actually also in the North Sea, we have the world's 2nd biggest, the 3rd biggest. The 4th biggest is being constructed, and that will then become the largest again. And we've got the world's first floating and the largest floating wind farms as well. We've installed a lot of solar. Surprisingly, here's a stat that will amaze people. It amazes me even as I repeat it for the 100th time. The UK produces as much solar power as France, despite France being twice the geographical mass, and also the weather in the UK not being quite as sunny as in France. So, we've managed to do a lot on renewables. We still need to go further. I think in answer to your question, you have now mechanisms in place to do that transition to renewables with several different acts from Congress, including the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we're seeing a great requirement for the skills and the knowledge and the technologies that have been built up over the last decade and a half and we're keen to work together on that. And that's just one example. Nuclear power, civil nuclear power, very obvious areas of deep cooperation, some of which already exist. There's much, much more to do with natural, obvious partners for all the reasons we discussed.
How about do your conversations include cooperating on critical materials? I mean, one of the great concerns has been we don't want a dependence on Russia to be, we'll get over the dependence on Russia, but then what about China?
Yeah.
And is that an area of potential cooperation?
Yeah, absolutely. Critical minerals are at the heart of virtually every form of renewable power and also nuclear power. So, I mean, they are, without sourcing out the supply chain to critical minerals, we can't make this this transition. So it's not, working with the US, but also other countries. Canada's a good example of lots of minerals, but many others as well, to make sure that we are not, again, change of policy, different world, who knows what will happen next, as the last few years have demonstrated. We must not be reliant on unreliable partners again. And I go back to the very obvious and most extreme example with our German friends finding themselves so reliant on Putin, who's turned out to be the least reliable interlocutor, whilst actually this last month closing down their nuclear power. They closed down their last reactor last month. So of course, critical minerals are at the heart of making sure that countries who share our values are able to secure the power that they need. So, there's some ideas that we've been discussing just in the last hour at my meeting here in Washington about how we further bring the world together to discuss this. Of course, we've been doing it at the G7 Energy Conference in Japan, in Sapporo and elsewhere. But actually, that was one of the subjects which watch this space. There's going to be more on this very soon.
We talked a little bit even before we came in that there are somewhat different approaches in the U.S. and the UK. We have our IRA, which created a lot of angst, which I think is dissolving some on the continent. What's Britain's view towards the IRA and towards the various approaches and
Well, the first thing to say is we're very careful to call it IRA. We've renamed it in the UK for reasons of history that that some will recognise.
Right, I guess that would be true.
So or the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think the fundamental issue is this: in the UK, we have a political consensus around the need to secure national energy security, and that one of the ways to do that, as you actually very accurately, I thought, summed up in your introduction, is to move to renewables so that we're not reliant on hydrocarbons that all too often, not always, I mean, we have North Sea oil and gas, you have a lot of LNG and other places are good partners, but actually all too often we end up too reliant on a single form of energy, and then the world changes geopolitically and we end up in difficulty. So in the UK, we have a political consensus that actually several years ago, and actually under this Conservative government, which will sound odd to an American ear, we passed legislation that said we had to get to net zero by 2050. So that was a cross-parliament agreement. Just a small twist to that is they also legislated essentially that the energy secretary could go to jail if we don't do it. Right. So when I say I'm working on this night and day, I mean at night in particular, because that's when you start to worry about this stuff. In truth, it would have to be for a contempt of court. It would have to be because I wasn't seriously addressing the issues. But nonetheless, we have that political consensus. In the US, clearly, it creates a big dividing line. And because it creates a big dividing line, it seems to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm just saying this from observing the US political scene, Congress has actually, in the end, sort of got to the same place, but not by using mandates and laws, but instead by using tax breaks and, on the other side of that, obviously having to raise the tax in the first place or add it to debt. So, that's the consensus that has come about and created not just the IRA, but also some of the other large acts which have now passed. Frankly, I think on balance, the world needs to get to this position of energy security. So whatever wills the means to the end, I think is right. There are one or two rough edges that we've been talking about, including critical minerals, which we're working through. But I think the world will be a better place for the biggest economy in the world actually being, in the driving seat as far as switching to renewables and more nuclear, which I think is a very big part of this as well.
Are you concerned about issues that, again, I think they're beginning to dissolve some, the competition issues relating to IRA or other, issues that might put Britain or other countries at a disadvantage? Or?
Yeah, so there are a couple of parts of guidance which have now been issued, which have helped to sort of take off some of these rough edges, as you know, and we're just working with administrations in London and in Washington to deal with the final parts of that jigsaw. But as I mentioned in the kind of intro, the opportunities, not just at a global level, to have the world's biggest economy actually moving towards this energy transition in a big way, but then also just from a entirely national point of view, to have so many businesses and organizations asking for assistance, help, experience, buying British expertise and British companies coming here and doing it. I mean, a lot of time I spend talking to companies who are, for example, going to the West Coast, which is where I'm going tomorrow, to California, because we've got gigawatts of offshore wind now, and we want to get to 50 gigawatts in the next 6.5 years off our coasts. California wants to, I think I saw their figure was 40 gigawatts or 45, something like that. They need the expertise. So it's a massive opportunity to work together and to provide goods and services to each other as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the EU. We've talked about the US-UK energy relationship and areas of cooperation and so forth. Post-Brexit relations with the EU. How closely do you work with Brussels on energy issues?
Well, let me be completely candid with you. They weren't happy that we left the club. We wanted our independence. I didn't actually happen to vote for Brexit personally, but I am a Democrat and I believe in democratic outcomes. And the country voted to leave. And actually, I was always torn on it because, to an American audience, I ask you, would you give up control over your borders, many of your laws, finances, although we weren't in the euro itself? Answer definitely no. And actually, why would Britain do something like that as well, which is gradually what the EU was becoming ever more so. So yes, it's been, I think it's fair and candid to say it's been a little bit tricky for a while. However, very, very pleased to report since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister and he helped to settle the Northern Ireland protocol issue through this thing called the Windsor Framework, it's been transformative. So just last month, I was out in Belgium, for example, at a leaders' summit on energy, to which Britain wasn't actually invited last year. Actually, a number of other countries weren't as well, so it wasn't just us. But now we are very much more working together. I have constant contact with my French, counterpart, my Belgian counterpart, my Netherlands, German, etc. So we are now working very, very closely. The other thing which has changed is not just the Windsor Framework. This winter, when Putin was holding Europe in particular hostage to energy blackmail, Europe, as in the EU, continental Europe, discovered that Britain, as ever, was the absolutely indispensable, reliable partner. France happened to have a lot of their nuclear power down over the summer, some scheduled, some not. They power most of their electricity from nuclear. Their fleet was down. We were exporting renewable energy to France through the interconnectors. And they saw that, we left the EU, but we didn't leave Europe. And we're still there as partners. And ditto, actually, with the war in Ukraine, where, as I mentioned before, our response has, I think, been foremost in the European countries. Very much better is the simple answer.
Speaking of Ukraine, and I don't know whether this is within your area, But on sanctions questions, energy sanctions questions, are there any differences in approach between, there's sort of a consistent G7 approach, but looking behind,
Yeah.
behind the scenes, are the views towards sanctions pretty much consistent with the U.S., Britain, with Brussels and the member states, key member states?
Yeah, I think actually broadly speaking, it's been one of the surprising. I think people may have doubted before February 24th last year whether the West would come together and properly react to what Putin's done. But I think beyond any shadow of a doubt, that's what's happened. And I mean, in terms of the UK's position at the time, I happened to be Transport Secretary. I made sure that we were the first to ban Russian aircraft in our skies, the first to ban Russian ships from our ports, and not just Russian ships, but ships that were being leased or had some funding behind them or were flagged or whatever else. Again, actually, one of the things about being able to make those policies independently is that we can be more fleet of foot and we can move faster. And we tried to do that through transport, but also through energy policies where, as I say, we weren't actually buying very much Russian hydrocarbon, but we immediately suspended the sale and now announced the suspension of the purchase, rather. But actually, frankly, the EU got there. Slightly slower timescale, but not critically. The US got there. I remember the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, calling me and saying it's going to be I think it was in the State of the Union, actually, as I recall. It's going to be in tonight's State of the Union. I've been pushing to make sure that, the same things that we had already done on transport were matched. So, I think actually the West has impressively moved in lockstep. And that is exactly as it should be.
Well, sanctions are never a zero-sum game. How do you think they're working? Are you happy with how the energy sanctions are working with the price caps and other sanctions?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I think sanctions are rather like this. If you put a sanction here, then the thing, whatever it is, it could be energy, but it could be anything else, finds its way around that. And if you just give it enough time, a new avenue, a new pathway, it's like business. It's very, it's very enterprising, and it will find its way around that sanction. And I think we see evidence of that in the way that the Russian economy has responded over a period of time. I think we have to be honest about the limitations of that. Having said that, when the world acts in unison, I think it still matters. It matters hugely because not just in the case of Putin, Russia and Ukraine, but also what other countries might think if we don't respond convincingly and together. So I have no doubt that oil still finds a way around. No doubt, and there are many arguments in favour and against a cap and floor prices and all these other things. The important thing, I think, is not the exact measure. I think the important thing is the cooperation in those measures, and I think we've seen terrific cooperation.
Right, and it's certainly been better than not having them.
Definitely.
So,
oh yeah.
Again, thinking about Ukraine, it's been a pretty good, I think we all would agree, a better than expected winter. Part of it being luck, part of it being good policy. Concerns about next winter. How concerned are you?
Well, as I say, I spend my day and nights thinking about these issues, but we got through the first winter, and that will have been the hardest one because we had to divert, or find replacement for all of that Russian hydrocarbon. So logic tells you that winter 2023-24 should be better, but we should not rest on our laurels. And that is one of the reasons why, actually I think, pay tribute to the United States, the way that the US has responded with LNG, the way that we already had LNG ports, and so we brought it into the UK and then exported it to Europe, the way that Germany now has built new capacity to bring LNG in. Other countries now, the United Arab Emirates, for example, will be coming on stream, if not this year, next year. So the world has found its way around these things. What I think now is really important, and I'm going to be saying and doing more on, and this is what I've been speaking with my American opposite number with today is thinking about the more medium term. So in the UK, as in the US, we've allowed nuclear civil power to reduce as a proportion of our power, but partly because we both had oil and gas. It became unfashionable. There were lots of protests about it. But actually, we are reversing that policy. We want a quarter of our energy to be nuclear civil. We want to exploit not just the gigawatt size of it, but also the small modular reactors. And there are many different designs from Rolls-Royce to Westinghouse and others. And we think the time has come for those things. I've just set up something called Great British Nuclear to take this forward. I've appointed a minister in the British government in my department who, for the first time ever, is responsible as the Minister for Nuclear. We've never had somebody with that title, and wakes up every day and that's what he focuses on. I think, again, with caution, if last winter was okay, then this winter will be, but nothing is set in stone. We could have terrible weather or something else. We need to keep making sure that we make sure the markets work properly. The price of gas has fallen dramatically at the moment. Again, we have to keep an eye on these things. But the medium term is where my focus is shifting to, because we need to get the energy mix right and secure in the longer term.
On nuclear, are you sensing a shift of opinion on nuclear in Britain, but in other places as well, the U.S., in Europe, or at least certainly parts of Europe, other parts of the world? Do you believe that in 2050, when you need to be at net zero, unless you've gone to jail in the meantime or whatever,
Find me in prison.
Do you think that nuclear is going to be a major part of the clean energy world?
I do. And I think, to answer the first part of your question, yes, attitudes have changed tremendously. For example, of all the nuclear reactors, we're producing about 16% of our electricity through nuclear right now in the UK. It's fairly similar in the US. Of all the reactors that are still operational right now in the UK, every single one of them was commissioned under a Conservative government, under the Tory party, my party. Now, I'm not making that as a political point. I'm making it because it demonstrates the fact that this was a deeply politically divisive issue in the past. It isn't now. And partly because of the war in Ukraine and the need for energy security, but also partly because of climate change issues and the rest, we have attributed the taxonomy to say that nuclear power is clean power in order to get the finance into that area as well. So I think there is a general acceptance. I think with technologies like small modular reactor, more countries who weren't using nuclear civilly for civil power before, I think are likely to in the future. And it's becoming much more practical than it was in the early days, because the technology has moved on 70 years.
Two more quick questions on nuclear come to mind. Is there cooperation today between either UK and US companies or UK and US laboratories on small modular reactors? And then I guess a somewhat unrelated question. Is the argument that nuclear development in the West is critical from a national security standpoint, relating to things like non-proliferation, concern about how nuclear power may be used by Russia, China, maybe other countries? Is that a salient argument, and also then the cooperation with the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, on the cooperation front, yes. It's like I'll tell you openly, it was one of the subjects we've been discussing today. Actually, I think there's a really interesting part of this, which harks back to one of your previous questions on the supply chain side of things. We've talked about supply chains of hydrocarbons, but actually there's also a supply chain in uranium enrichment, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of work to go on there. Both the UK and the US have pretty unique skills and knowledge in these areas, and very few countries in the world are in a position to carry out the enrichment and some of the processes that come after enrichment. We're both signed up to non-proliferation, so it's very important that the way this is done is internationally responsible. And again, I think it's one of the very good reasons why the UK and the US should and are starting to work very closely together on nuclear. And uranium has to be enriched to a very different level for civil nuclear and some of the SMRs, and then advanced modular reactor, AMR technologies in particular, to, if you want to turn it into a weapon at 80 or 90, 95% enriched. So that we're talking about two very different things. And I think some of these new technologies are incredibly exciting. I was with a British firm who are working on a Magnox system, which is technology that's been around for a while. But the advantage of Magnox is if you had a leak, it comes into the air and it freezes immediately if it's anything less than 550 degrees C. So there's lots of very interesting work going on, lots of great science going on. And of course, even way beyond that, we've talked about fission. Just talk about fusion. I went with the Prime Minister when I launched the document you mentioned, Powering Up Britain, to Oxford, where we have a research centre in Callum, and we stood next to the hottest place in certainly the solar system, 10 times hotter than the sun at a tokamak there. So it's always 20 years away to get to fusion, but again, that kind of quality of research, I think, is incredible.
And I want to get to audience questions. If anybody has a question, please come up to the microphone over there. I mean, I've got enough questions to last for the next hour and a half, but we'd like to get some questions while you're going up. It sounds like that you take, I think what we do, an all of the above approach towards, and maybe agnostic on technologies as to how we're going to achieve net zero. Do you have priorities? I mean, as you're thinking about what you have to do you have a list of priorities, like, and then I'm saying it's this, but like nuclear first, and hydrogen second, and something else third, or is it sort of like we're going to look at all of these things and see how they develop?
I do, but the overriding principle is we must never be we must never be driven by a single technology, right? If it's oil and gas, and we went a long way to oil and gas, not least because we were producing a lot of it in the North Sea, then as that starts to run down, we're starting to import it, and then you start to get reliant. Or in France, nuclear, they have a terrific nuclear industry. They're building 2 of our nuclear power stations at Hinkley Point and at Sizewell, and they're running the rest. But actually, as they would say, this summer, a lot of them were down for scheduled and unfortunately some unscheduled maintenance, and suddenly they're short in power. And so on and so forth. The wind doesn't always blow. The sun doesn't always shine. So we have we produced last year 57% of our electricity in the last 12 months has come from renewables and nuclear together. It's great. But if the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, then you need to rely more on that nucler and so on and so forth.
I thought the sun always shined.
Of course,
London.
I know. But amazingly, there are occasions. So I think, first of all, energy mix. Secondly, you ask, to what extent are we directing that? Well, we have set out in a lot of detail how much of our energy we want to get from these different forms. So offshore winds, 50 gigawatts by 2030. That's 6.5 years' time. We're saying we want on hydrogen 10 gigawatts, at least half of which has to be green rather than blue. We set out on nuclear 24 gigawatts into the future to get to a quarter of our power. So yeah, we're doing that. And probably the most exciting thing, I just want to say this before we take the question: carbon capture, utilization and storage, CCUS, 4 initials that I bet actually if I polled it at home in Britain, most people won't have heard of, could be £1 trillion, trillion dollar industry. And I'm very excited about that, not least because geographically, or geology, from a geological point of view, the North Sea, in fact, in many cases where we took the oil and gas out of, has a lot of storage potential.
That's great. Well, let's get a question from the audience. if you could identify yourself and ask the question.
Mr. Secretary, I'm George Pickart with the General Electric Company. We're very pleased to be deeply embedded in UK's electricity sector, working across all of the technologies that you've mentioned, whether it's onshore or offshore wind or nuclear, SMR, grid equipment technology, et cetera. You couldn't have teed up my question any better. We've been spending a lot of time and investing a lot of money in how do you decarbonize gas, because we don't see a future of the electricity system without that large rotating equipment on the grid. So the issue is, how do you produce that with fewer carbon emissions? And so we're pursuing both expanding our hydrogen capability and also working with a number of different collaborators on carbon capture and storage. And I wanted to commend you and your government for the strategy that you've put in place on carbon capture. We're quite interested, as you probably know, in collaborating on the Net Zero Teesside project, and you've put together a very good vision, a strategy, the financial mechanisms, the funding. I think what's missing really is sort of the time-bound element of it. I just wondered if maybe you could tell us, do you expect a decision on these projects to go forward within the next year, and can we look forward to that?
Yeah, so, well, I should explain, thank you for the question, and thank you for what GE does as well, because it's a great partnership. It's a very good example. The strange thing is, I spend my time going around the world to countries saying, how have you done it? And that's, well, actually, largely with the help of your businesses who've come in and invested in these renewables and much else. And that is a great, I mean, we're capitalists. We believe this is the way to bring the best technologies together and then often re-export them as well. So, thanks for that. Secondly, on CCUS, in that Powering Up Britain document, we announced a £20 billion initial program. This is track one of our CCUS clusters. And as you mentioned, Teesside, which is in the northeast, and the northwest are the two kind of areas where this developed. And then we're going to have expansions to those. And there's some clusters in Scotland and also in the Humber, also on the east coast. Track one expansion will be this year. And then we're actually going to have track two as well. So that is, the 20 billion is the first part of it over 20 years. So and the reason, I should just explain actually, Ambassador, to your audience, the reason that I'm saying all this and we're so excited about it and why the question's so relevant is that we know that by 2050, we will still need oil and gas. This isn't just me saying this. This is because the IPCC, the global sort of experts say there will still be oil and gas being required, in which case you've got to deal with the CO2. We have enough space in the North Sea for 78 billion tons of CO2. Now, what is 78 billion tons? It's 15 billion elephants, well-fed ones. It's 200 million St. Paul's cathedrals for the British audience here online. It's a lot of space. It would take probably 100 years worth of British CO2 and 100 years of all of European CO2, which we can bury under the North Sea. So this is very much in line with the overall mission of both energy security and net zero, and projects which look to help with that are already getting our backing. So I mean, I'm not quite sure on the project that GE is particularly interested in, but it may be that it's in a track one expansion or track two path right now, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we have two more questions that I see right now, and we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. And I also think it's important before we finish, I don't know if 3:45 is an absolute cutoff, but Ukraine reconstruction, and there's a conference June 21st to 25th, and your views on that. Maybe we take these two questions. Why don't we take the two questions and then answer them together, and then maybe if you have any comments on Ukraine, and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. My name is Kevin Gunderson. I'm with Huntsman Corporation, and we are the world's leading spray foam insulation company. And in your remarks, you discussed many options for energy security, but your government has done the one thing that no other government has done, which is make insulation the centerpiece of its energy policy. You talked about medium and long-term solutions. We feel very strongly and are very supportive of what you are doing, that insulation is a short and medium-term solution to the energy crisis. It's a relatively old technology, and people don't really think about it, but it does work in lowering greenhouse gas emissions and lowering utility bills. The British government has had various iterations in the past of insulation schemes, and given the amount of funding and the support this time around, what are you in the government doing to make sure that the execution of this program works this time around, given the importance of the issue at the moment?
Thank you. Let's have Lee's question, and then maybe you can
Sure.
respond to that and maybe say a little something on Ukraine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. My name is Lee Beck. I'm with the Clean Air Task Force. We're a global climate organization. Thank you so much for your fantastic remarks about technology optionality, next generation technologies, carbon capture, nuclear fusion. It's really, really fantastic. And you said something really important, that oil and gas will likely be around still by 2050. COP26 saw the launch of the Global Methane Pledge. COP28 will be where we're going to be really talking about the decarbonization and reducing emissions from the fossil fuel sector. What is your vision for methane mitigation, one of the fastest ways to act on climate in the near term?
Great. So
Thank you. Should I take those?
Yeah, why don't you
together?
just take
Yeah.
those two, and then if you could say a little bit about Ukraine.
Sure. Well, so first of all, I love your point about insulation. I mean, the best energy is the energy you don't have to use in the first place, and it's kind of the high energy bills that people have been paying has suddenly both changed the maths, or math, as you would say, and it has also changed made people have another fresh look at it, even though the technology, as you rightly say, has by and large been around. So I think it's enormously important. We're always being pushed to go further, but it's worth saying that when we came to power, this Conservative administration, which was in 2010, only about 14% of homes were adequately insulated, A to C on an energy rating. It's now just approaching half of homes. So we've done half the job. Right now, in terms of size and scale, we have £12 billion in the current periods going into this, I think up till 2028. And we're working on new ways to target that. So we're about to launch something called the Great British Insulation Drive, which you'll be hearing more of very soon. But yeah, I think it's massively important. Obviously, when new homes go up, they're much better insulated. We have a lot of Victorian housing stock, and they were very good builders, the Victorians, but not very good at building well-insulated, warm buildings necessarily. So, yeah, more to happen on that front. I'm just furiously looking my notes on methane, because I noticed a stat when I was having a think about this earlier, which I was blown away by, which is like something like a 60% reduction in our methane, but I'm afraid I cannot spot the exact number right now. But that pledge from COP26. Our 60% reduction is not from COP26, it's from earlier than that. But that pledge is incredibly important, and we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we will go on about CO2. But there are many other forms of greenhouse gases. So there are a lot of different responses that we need to take. The brilliant thing about all this stuff is, again, Ukraine, the high prices has made us look differently at it. Energy security, national energy security. In my case, I say, so powering Britain from Britain, I always say, it's just a flip side of the coin of net zero. That's why we named the department Energy Security and Net Zero. It's actually the same thing. To get there, to be really secure, we need to go through that whole transition. So, and that's our stated direction. And you very kindly asked about the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference. It's in London this summer. I actually took over the presidency on behalf of the UK from the Swiss, who ran the conference last year. There's a huge amount of activity going in to that. I'm speaking to my Ukrainian counterparts. I know the whole world, or the whole civilized world, will be there to help and support Ukraine, which we must do, because in my view, Ukraine could be lost in two different ways. We could lose it because we don't stick together, we don't have these different sanctions, we don't respond to the energy crisis. But we could equally lose it by allowing Ukraine to be destroyed even if they win. And that would be completely and utterly unacceptable.
And just very briefly, because we have run out of time, how would you begin to approach Ukraine energy reconstruction, and with the potential of ultimately Ukraine becoming a real energy powerhouse in Europe.
Yeah. Well, I think I've been speaking on a personal basis. I've been speaking to my opposite numbers. Initially, Alexander Kubakov, who is Minister for Reconstruction and Infrastructure and Transport at the time, now Deputy Prime Minister, and also my direct opposite number. And actually, I'm speaking to them. The first thing I do when I get home is speaking to them again in advance of this conference as well. And Ukraine has huge potential assets. I mean, in the same way as they're the breadbasket of the world, or certainly of Europe and perhaps Africa, they also have the potential to be both in renewable energy, but also in modernized nuclear civil energy as well. So, we're very keen to make sure for their sake, but also I think for the world's sake, that they are assisted in being brought back to what they'll need to be to rebuild that industry and rebuild the country's economy as well. It's a very close work. I've been personally very committed to all this. I've had Ukrainians living in my house for the last year, a family of 3, and their dog as well, Mad Max. So I've been very, very much, it's been every time I've gone home, I've been reminded of how evil that war has been, and Britain, and I know America, are committed to Ukraine's future.
Right. And I can assure you everybody here, I think, is likewise committed. Unfortunately, we have come to a close. I've been getting sort of dirty looks from our event staff because I think we've gone overtime. But and I think we could have gone for another hour or two. But it's been great, and I really want to thank Secretary Shapps for joining us and offering his insights on Britain's path forward, but on energy and climate, not just Britain, I'm looking at it from a more global standpoint. And I hope you'll be visiting us many times and maybe come back to our Global Energy Forum. But I also would like to thank all of you who joined us in studio, as well as those around the world who are watching this virtually. And I would remind everybody that there is a recording of this conversation that's available or will be available on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and the Atlantic Council webpage. I'd also like to thank those here who made the event possible. Olga Kakova, who's the Deputy Director at the Energy Center, responsible for European energy security, Katie Kenny, Patty Ryan, Frank Willey, Max Zandy, and our wonderful event staff. So please join us for future events, Atlantic Council events. We will be having our 8th annual, I've been here 8 years, so I guess I started at the first year. The 8th annual Central and Eastern European Energy Conference, Energy Security Conference, that takes place on June 15th, in person and online. And there'll be more information on that on the webpage. And just keep watching our webpage for events. So again, this was On the Record, and take care. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
That's great.